Welcome back, fellow travelers, to Law to Action, the channel, where we descend into the deepest layers of gaming's most extraordinary stories and pull apart every thread until we understand not just what happened, but why it had to happen and what it means for the rest of us still looking up at the sky. Today, we are going somewhere genuinely spectacular. We are going to Columbia. There are games, and then there are experiences so tightly wound with meaning and philosophy and emotional devastation that they redefine what interactive storytelling can accomplish. BioShock Infinite, released in 2013 by Irrational Games under the direction of Ken Levine, is unambiguously in that second category. It is a game that opens with a lighthouse and ends with 1, 2, and in between, it asks questions about American identity, about the nature of guilt, about whether a man can truly escape who he is by simply deciding to become someone else. It does all of this while also being one of the most visually stunning, mechanically inventive, and emotionally punishing games ever made. But today is not about the gameplay mechanics, not primarily. Today is about the story, the complete story, not just the surface narrative of a gruff ex-Pinkerton sent to retrieve a girl from a floating city, but the entire web of alternate realities, quantum physics, religious fanaticism, political oppression, fatherly guilt, and cosmic consequence that underlies every single moment of the experience. We are going to look at Columbia from every angle, its architecture and ideology, its secret history and its public mythology, its heroes and its monsters, and the moment when the game reveals that those two categories might be populated by the very same person. To do this properly, we need to understand the world that BioShock Infinite is commenting on. The game is set in 1912, the height of a particular strain of American confidence and American ugliness. It was an era of soaring technological ambition, of the Wright brothers and the Titanic, and the belief that human ingenuity had no ceiling. It was also an era of brutal racial hierarchy, of Jim Crow laws, of Chinese exclusion acts, of institutional violence against indigenous peoples that the American government had not yet even begun to reckon with. It was a time when many Americans genuinely believed in something called manifest destiny, the idea that God himself had ordained the United States to expand, to dominate, and to carry its version of civilization to every corner of the world, whether that world wanted it or not. Columbia is what happens when you take that belief and give it an entire floating city to inhabit. It is America's worst ideological impulses given a literal body, a seat of government, a theology, and a skyline, and BioShock Infinite forces you to walk through it, to see it, to fight within it, and ultimately to reckon with what it means that the man being asked to destroy it is made of the exact same material as the man who built it. Over the next several thousand words, we are going to cover everything. We will begin at the very beginning. The conception and construction of Columbia, who built it, why it was built, and what it was supposed to represent. We will trace the history of the city's prophet, Zachary Hale Comstock, right back to the frozen banks of Wounded Knee Creek, and the moment that split one man's life into two irreconcilable destinies. We will dive into the quantum physics of the Lutece field and the extraordinary twins, or rather, the same person in two bodies, who made the impossible possible. We will unravel the heartbreaking origin of Elizabeth, whose very existence is the product of a father's moment of weakness, a stolen childhood, and a severed fingertip that bridges two realities. We will examine the social architecture of Columbia's oppressive hierarchy and the revolutionary fires that were already burning beneath its gilded surface, long before any false shepherd arrived. We will follow Booker DeWitt's arrival, his partnership with Elizabeth, the shocking revelations that accumulate like thunderclouds throughout the second half of the game, and finally, the stunning, philosophy-dense, morally complex ending that still generates passionate debate a decade after release. By the time we are done, you will understand not just what happened in Columbia, but why it had to happen exactly this way, in this story, told by these characters. Because BioShock Infinite is ultimately about one thing above all else, the question of whether a person can be redeemed without being destroyed. And the answer it arrives at is one of the most devastating in the history of the medium. So, settle in, get comfortable, The elevator is rising. The clouds are parting. And there, gleaming and impossible and beautiful and terrible, is Columbia. High above the clouds in 1912, a city floats in defiance of gravity itself. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. Somewhere above the Earth's surface, suspended by technology that should not exist in the early 20th century, there is an entire functioning city, with streets and shops and churches and factories and residential districts, and a government and an ideology and a flag, and it is drifting through the sky like a dream that refuses to end. Its name is Columbia, taken from the female personification of the United States that was common in American iconography of the period. The name itself is a deliberate act of ownership. This city does not merely represent America. It claims to be the purest distillation of America, the real America, the true America, the America that the corrupt politicians and compromised institutions of the surface world have abandoned and betrayed. Columbia is not just a place. It is a theological argument, and every inch of its architecture has been designed to make that argument as loudly and as beautifully as possible. The history of Columbia's construction begins in the laboratories of one woman, Rosalind Lutece, a quantum physicist of extraordinary genius, whose work on atomic manipulation led her to discover what she would call the Lutece field. Through theoretical and then practical manipulation of quantum mechanics, Lutece found a way to lock atoms in fixed positions in space, not relative to the Earth, not tethered to gravity's insistence, but fixed in absolute terms relative to the fabric of space-time itself. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If you could lock atoms in position, you could, in principle, suspend any object at all, regardless of its mass, at any altitude indefinitely. You could make a rock float. You could make a building float. You could, if your ambition and your resources were sufficient, make an entire city float. Rosalind Lutece published her findings cautiously, as brilliant scientists in precarious political climates tend to do. But cautious publication still attracts attention, and the attention of a particular man found her work extraordinarily useful. Zachary Hale Comstock, already establishing himself as a charismatic religious figure, approached Lutece with a proposition. He claimed to have been visited by an archangel who revealed to him a vision of a city in the clouds, a new Eden suspended above the corruption of the surface world, destined to serve as the vessel of America's divine purpose. Lutece's quantum field was, Comstock declared, the scientific instrument through which this divine vision would be made real. Whether he genuinely believed this or had already discovered, through early TARE observations, that such a city was possible and was simply supplying a theological explanation, the game leaves open, though what we later learn about how his prophecy actually worked tilts the balance toward the latter. We will return to the truth behind Comstock's prophetic claims shortly. For now, what matters is that his proposition attracted the backing of the United States Congress, which saw enormous potential in a floating platform that could serve as a mobile showcase of American technological and cultural superiority. The original vision, as presented to Congress and to the public, was relatively benign. Columbia would serve as a floating World's Fair, traveling the globe to display the achievements of American civilization. It would be a diplomatic tool, a public relations triumph, a demonstration to the rest of the world that American ingenuity had no limits. Columbia was launched to enormous fanfare in 1893, the same year as the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. While ordinary Americans marveled at the white city rising from the shores of Lake Michigan, the truly extraordinary vision of Columbia was ascending into the clouds. Initial public reaction to the floating city was rapturous. Here, at last, was proof of everything American exceptionalism promised. Here was the future, made present, made real, made impossibly beautiful. But Columbia was never going to remain the sanitized diplomatic showcase its government backers imagined, because the man at its helm had a very different vision, one that was already fully formed before the first stone was laid, one that he had been carefully concealing behind the acceptable language of national pride and religious devotion. Zachary Hale Comstock did not want a floating World's Fair. He wanted a sovereign nation. He wanted a chosen people. He wanted, in the truest theological sense of the word, a new Jerusalem, a city of God's elect, purified of the racial and moral contamination that he believed had infected the surface world, elevated above it literally and figuratively, and destined to eventually descend in righteous judgment upon the Sodom below. The architecture of Columbia reflects this vision with overwhelming totality. Every public space, every park and plaza and promenade is dominated by monuments to the Founding Fathers, but not the Founding Fathers as historical figures. In Columbia, Washington and Jefferson and Franklin have been transformed into divine prophets, their images rendered in the same visual language as saints and apostles, their words treated as holy scripture. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are not political documents in Columbia. They are sacred texts revealed directly by God to his chosen instruments, establishing not just a nation, but a covenant between the Almighty and the American people. Columbia was not built to showcase America. It was built to replace it, to be the version of America that Comstock believed God had always intended, stripped of compromise, stripped of equality, stripped of everything except the pure, fierce, terrifying certainty of its founders' faith. The racial hierarchy that defines Columbia's social order was baked into the city's founding ideology from the very beginning. Comstock's theology drew on a particularly virulent strain of early 20th century Protestant nationalism that identified white Anglo-Saxon Protestants as the true heirs of God's covenant, with everyone else occupying various positions on a divinely ordained hierarchy that placed them in permanent states of subordination or exclusion. Chinese immigrants, Irish Catholics, African Americans, and other minority populations were permitted to exist in Columbia primarily insofar as they could provide cheap labor for the city's economic machinery. They could never be citizens. They could never be equal. The theology said so. The architecture said so. The curriculum taught to Columbia's children from their earliest years said so. Columbia's relationship with its American government backers deteriorated rapidly once the city's true character became apparent, and catastrophically once Comstock made the decision to intervene, without authorization, in the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. We will examine that specific episode in greater detail later in our story. For now, the essential point is this. 2 years after the Boxer Rebellion, in 1902, Columbia formally seceded from the United States, retreating into the clouds and declaring itself a sovereign nation. By the time Booker DeWitt arrives in 1912, the game's anniversary celebration marks the city's 10th year of independence. What had been conceived as a monument to America had become America's most extreme and most dangerous critic, a city that believed the surface world had betrayed everything sacred, and that nursed the ambition, eventually, to descend and set it right by force. That is the city that Booker DeWitt is sent to enter in 1912. That is the city whose every beautiful inch is a testament to a vision of human society that is, at its root, a horror. And that understanding, that beauty and atrocity can occupy exactly the same space, can be constructed from exactly the same materials, can even be genuinely felt by those who live within them, is one of the central moral arguments of BioShock Infinite. To understand Columbia, you must understand Comstock. And to understand Comstock, you must travel backwards through time, not metaphorically, not in memory, but through the actual, literal mechanism of quantum tears in space-time, to the winter of 1890, and a frozen creek in South Dakota, where history committed one of its most shameful acts, and one young soldier committed one of his. His name, before the baptism, was Booker DeWitt. Born on April 19, 1874, he enlisted in the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. At only 16 years old, a unit whose previous defining moment had been the catastrophic defeat at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. Now, the 7th Cavalry was engaged in what the Army called the Indian Wars, a campaign of systematic suppression, displacement, and violence against the indigenous peoples of the American plains. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, that campaign reached its most devastating single moment. What began as an attempt to disarm a group of Lakota Sioux escalated, through fear, through miscommunication, through the hair-trigger tension of soldiers who had been told to expect resistance, into a massacre. When the gunfire stopped, somewhere between 250 and 300 Lakota people lay dead, the majority of them women, children, and elderly. It was not a battle. It was not a military engagement in any meaningful sense. It was a slaughter. Booker DeWitt was there. He participated. Exactly what he did during those terrible minutes, the game largely leaves in shadows. But what little is revealed is damning. The voxophone recordings of soldiers like Cornelius Slate and Preston Downs describe Booker taking scalps, and his nickname among his fellow soldiers was the White Injune, a moniker that speaks to extraordinary brutality rather than restraint. He left Wounded Knee with an attained rank of staff sergeant and a weight of guilt so enormous and so shapeless that he could find no way to hold it without it destroying him. The guilt was real. This matters enormously for understanding everything that follows. Booker DeWitt was not indifferent to what he had done. The violence at Wounded Knee broke something fundamental in him, and in the years that followed his discharge, he moved through the world as a man who no longer believed he deserved to be in it. He joined the Pinkertons, where he was eventually fired for using extreme methods, including breaking labor strikes with violence. He met and married a woman named Annabelle Watson, and together they had a daughter, Anna. But Annabelle died in childbirth, and Booker was left alone with an infant daughter, a crushing weight of unprocessed guilt, and a gambling addiction that would eventually swallow him whole. He had become a private investigator by the time his debts turned catastrophic, a man punishing himself in slow motion, lacking the language, the framework, the emotional vocabulary to do anything else. Then came the river baptism. Conducted by a preacher named Whiting, the ceremony offered something that Booker desperately wanted, but could not quite bring himself to accept: the possibility of a fresh start. The possibility that the water could wash away not just sin in the abstract, but the specific, terrible, indelible thing he had done at Wounded Knee Creek. The possibility that Booker DeWitt could go under the water and come up as someone else entirely. And here is the moment. Here is the hinge of the entire story of BioShock Infinite. At the bank of that river, Booker DeWitt made a choice, or rather, in the quantum reality of the game's multiverse, he made both choices simultaneously, splitting the timeline into two divergent paths that would eventually collide in catastrophic fashion in the floating city of Columbia. The game's BioShock wiki makes this precise. In Rosalind's reality, Booker accepted the baptism and became Comstock. In Robert's reality, the one we inhabit as players, Booker refused at the last second, feeling that water alone could not cleanse what he had done. In one timeline, Booker DeWitt refused the baptism. He stood at the edge of the water, and he could not do it. Whether from a fundamental conviction that forgiveness was something he had not earned and did not deserve, or simply from a deep skepticism about the spiritual mechanics being offered to him, he turned away from the river and walked back into his life of guilt and self-destruction. This is the Booker we play as in BioShock Infinite, a man hollowed out by what he did, running from it rather than facing it, ultimately making the terrible choice to sell his infant daughter to pay off gambling debts, before immediately regretting it with every fiber of his being. This Booker carries his guilt as an open wound. It defines him. It haunts him. It makes him capable of both tremendous violence and eventually tremendous sacrifice. In the other timeline, Booker DeWitt accepted the baptism. He went under the water, and he came up as Zachary Hale Comstock, not literally, not in a single dramatic moment of transformation, but as the beginning of a process by which the guilt that had been consuming him was redirected, rechanneled, transformed from self-accusation into divine purpose. Comstock did not stop feeling the weight of Wounded Knee. He simply found a theological framework that converted that weight from evidence of his sinfulness into proof of his chosenness. God had tested him. God had put him through the fire, and God had found him worthy. Key insight: the nature of Comstock. Comstock's frequent exposure to the Lutece field tear-viewing machinery, not the siphon, which was built later to suppress Elizabeth, caused accelerated cellular aging, cancer, and sterility. The siphon is a separate device built to dampen Elizabeth's powers. Rosalind Lutece's own voxophone, confirms the tear machinery gave Comstock rapid aging and rendered him infertile. This distinction matters. The siphon controlled Elizabeth. The Lutece field machine destroyed Comstock's body in exchange for his prophetic edge. The transformation from DeWitt to Comstock was not merely psychological, though the psychological dimension was profound. It had practical physical consequences as well, because Comstock's path led him directly to Rosalind Lutece and her quantum field experiments, and his frequent exposure to the reality-altering machinery they developed together caused significant cellular damage that manifested as accelerated aging. By 1912, when the events of BioShock Infinite take place, Comstock is physically 40 years old but appears to be a man in his late 60s at least, white-bearded, deeply lined, carrying the visible weight of time in a body that has aged at twice the normal rate. For a prophet, this was not necessarily a disadvantage. The appearance of ancient wisdom, of a man who has lived long and suffered greatly in the service of God's plan, only reinforced the mythology he was constructing around himself. But the exposure to Lutece's machinery had one consequence that could not be spiritualized or incorporated into the prophet's mystique. It rendered him sterile. Comstock could not father children, and a prophet without an heir is a prophet whose vision dies with him. The dynasty he was building, the eternal city in the sky, the chosen people, the new Eden that would one day descend in judgment upon the Sodom below, required a successor. It required a child who could inherit his prophetic mantle, who could be shaped from birth to embody the values and the vision that Comstock had dedicated his life to establishing. The solution Comstock arrived at was one that required the full power of Lutece's most advanced quantum technology. It was a solution that constituted, by any reasonable moral standard, an act of monstrous selfishness and cruelty, and it is a solution that sits at the absolute center of BioShock Infinite's story, because the child Comstock stole, the child he would rename Elizabeth and raise as his prophesied heir, was the daughter of his own alternate self. The daughter of the Booker DeWitt who had walked away from the river, at the heart of Columbia's impossible existence, and at the heart of BioShock Infinite's most mind-bending narrative revelations, lies the scientific work of the Lutece twins, though describing them as twins is, as we will discover, a profound mischaracterization that gets at something true about their relationship, while missing entirely what they actually are. Rosalind Lutece is, in any straightforward sense, the most important person in Columbia's history. Without her, the city does not exist. Without her discovery of the quantum field that bears her name, the floating city remains exactly what it would have been without her. A fantasy. A vision in a charismatic con man's head. A story told to people who want to believe that God has a specific plan for their specific race and their specific nation. Comstock provided the ideology and the charisma. Rosalind Lutece provided the physics that made the ideology literal. The Lutece field works, at a conceptual level, by locking atoms in fixed positions in absolute space, not relative to the Earth's surface, not relative to sea level, not relative to anything that is itself subject to gravitational attraction, but fixed in absolute terms that override the ordinary behavior of matter under gravity. When the field is applied to a sufficiently large structure, that structure effectively becomes immune to the downward pull of gravity. It does not fight gravity. It does not generate upward thrust to counteract gravity. It simply ceases to experience gravity in the ordinary way. The result is that massive structures, buildings, streets, entire city districts, can be suspended in the atmosphere at arbitrary altitudes, in any configuration, without any continuous energy expenditure to maintain their position. The practical engineering challenges of building a city in this way are almost unimaginable. The structural stresses involved when a city district is not sitting on solid ground but hanging in air, subject to atmospheric turbulence and wind shear, required entirely novel approaches to architecture and construction. But Columbia solved these challenges with a combination of Lutece field applications, conventional engineering brilliance, and the simple fact that Comstock had effectively unlimited government funding for the first decade of the city's existence.
Kamsazam fluid en foililikens, ervoor revised die combustion weer verblijf, en effectively Ezref is effect.
for the first decade of the city's existence. The result is a cityscape of startling beauty, soaring spires and graceful bridges and suspended gardens and promenades that offer views of nothing but cloud and sky in every direction. But Rosalind Lutece's discoveries did not stop at the Lutece field. The deeper she went into the quantum mechanics underlying her levitation technology, the more she began to perceive something that the equations were strongly suggesting: that the universe we inhabit is not the only universe there is, that at every point of quantum uncertainty, every moment where a particle could go one way or the other, every decision point where cause and effect branch, there is not just one outcome but many, each one playing out in its own separate branch of reality. The universe, her mathematics was telling her, is not a single stream but an infinite delta, constantly branching and rebranching, with every possible outcome of every possible event occurring somewhere. The implication of this discovery, once Rosalind had followed it to its practical conclusion, was staggering. If parallel realities existed, and if the quantum field manipulation she was already capable of could be tuned to interact with the boundary conditions between realities, then it might be possible to create windows between them. Not travel, at first, just observation. Windows through which one could peer into adjacent realities and see how things had unfolded differently. Windows that, for someone with the right access and the right understanding, could provide effectively unlimited intelligence about the future, because in any adjacent reality, where time was moving at the same rate, but events had unfolded slightly differently, one could observe outcomes that had not yet occurred in one's own timeline. This is how Comstock's prophetic powers worked. This is the entire mechanism behind the reputation that made him revered as a prophet by Columbia's citizens, and feared as a genuine seer by everyone who encountered him. He was not receiving divine revelation. He was watching television from the future, or rather, he was watching through tears in space-time into parallel realities, where the future he wanted to predict had already happened, and he was reporting what he saw as divinely inspired prophecy. What his followers believed to be divine revelation was, in reality, advanced quantum physics dressed in the language of scripture. Comstock was not a prophet. He was a man with a telescope pointed at tomorrow. Now we come to the strangest and most poignant element of the Lutece story, the twins themselves. Rosalind Lutece, working in Columbia's reality, made a discovery that followed logically from everything else she had found. If parallel realities exist, and if tears between them can be created, then there must be a version of Rosalind Lutece in every adjacent reality, a version who has made the same discoveries or different ones, or who has gone in entirely different directions. In one particular adjacent reality, the version of Rosalind Lutece who existed was, due to the different role of biological dice at the moment of conception, male. His name in that reality was Robert Lutece. The connection between Rosalind and Robert across the dimensional boundary was immediate and profound, as it would have to be, given that they were, in every sense that mattered, the same person. They shared the same fundamental intelligence, the same theoretical frameworks, the same way of approaching problems, and the same increasingly sharp moral concerns about the uses to which their work was being put. Rosalind used the tear technology to bring Robert across the dimensional boundary into Columbia's reality, and together they continued their research, two versions of the same brilliant scientist, each providing a perspective the other lacked, their collaboration producing insights that neither could have reached alone. Their relationship with Comstock began as willing collaboration and ended as something much darker. Initially, both Luteces believed in the project, or at least believed that the scientific opportunities it offered outweighed the ideological compromises it required. But as Comstock's vision for Columbia grew more extreme, as his plans for Elizabeth's future became clear, and as his willingness to commit murder to protect his secrets became evident, both Luteces began to withdraw their cooperation. The breaking point was the theft of Anna DeWitt. Robert Lutece's participation in the kidnapping, approaching Booker DeWitt, offering the deal, transporting the infant through the tear, was the last act he would willingly perform in Comstock's service. The sight of Booker's anguish, the traumatic severing of Anna's finger in the closing dimensional portal, made something crystallize in both Luteces that had been building for years. They were complicit in atrocities, and they had to find a way to undo them. Comstock, sensing the Lutece's moral withdrawal and rightly fearing what they might reveal, arranged their deaths, ordering Jeremiah Fink to sabotage the Lutece device itself. When the twins attempted to use the tampered machine, it malfunctioned catastrophically. Rather than killing them, the malfunction scattered them across all realities simultaneously, placing them in a quantum superposition that made them effectively immortal and omnipresent. They existed in all timelines at once. They could observe outcomes across infinite realities. They remembered every iteration of every plan they had attempted, and they spent the years that followed trying, repeatedly, to bring a version of Booker DeWitt to Columbia that might finally break the pattern, not just change the outcome of specific events, but address the fundamental constants that made those events inevitable. By the time of the game's events, they had attempted this rescue at least 122 times across different realities, according to the timeline established in the game's lore. Every time we see the Lutece in BioShock Infinite, flipping coins, making cryptic observations, appearing in impossible locations, we are seeing beings who have shed their humanity piece by piece under the weight of infinite awareness. They are not malevolent. They are not indifferent. They are simply so far beyond the ordinary human experience of time and consequence that their compassion has become detached, architectural, concerned with the shape of the problem rather than the suffering of the individuals within it. It is one of the game's quietest and most haunting character portraits. Perhaps no story in the whole sprawling tapestry of BioShock Infinite is more heartbreaking, more intimate in its tragedy, than the origin of Elizabeth Comstock. Her story does not begin in Columbia. It begins in a shabby apartment in the tenements of New York City in October of 1893, with a father who loves his daughter and loves his gambling more, and who made one terrible decision in a moment of desperation that he spent the next 19 years trying to run away from. In the timeline, where Booker DeWitt walked away from the river baptism, his life proceeded along the trajectory that guilt and self-destruction tend to carve. He joined the Pinkertons, was eventually fired for using extreme methods, and then met and married a woman named Annabelle Watson. Together they had a daughter, Anna. But Annabelle died in childbirth, and Booker was left alone, a single father with a broken career, a gambling addiction, and a grief he couldn't articulate on top of the guilt he already couldn't carry. He became a private investigator after leaving the Pinkertons, but his debts grew faster than his caseload could manage. The financial pressure built to an impossible level, and then on October 8, 1893, Robert Lutece appeared at his door with an offer from Comstock: bring us the girl and wipe away the debt. Comstock himself was present for the actual transaction. It was Comstock, accompanied by Robert Lutece, who came to collect Anna. The offer was, in retrospect, a version of the deal Comstock had always intended to make. He had seen through tears into other realities that Booker's alternate self had fathered a child, and what Comstock could not produce himself, he was willing to reach across dimensional boundaries to take. Booker said yes. In his desperation, in his financial terror, in the moral fog that had surrounded him since Wounded Knee, he convinced himself that saying yes was not entirely wrong, that giving Anna to people who could provide for her was perhaps even better for her than staying with a broken-down private detective who could barely provide for himself. He handed over his daughter, and the instant he did, he knew it was the worst thing he had ever done, which, given that his list of terrible acts included participating in the massacre of women and children, was saying something profound about what it meant to sell your own child. He changed his mind immediately. He ran after them. He caught up with Comstock and Robert Lutece as they prepared to step through the tear back to Columbia's reality, and in the desperate struggle that followed, as the dimensional portal began to close, Anna was halfway through the transition. The tear's edge, the literal boundary between realities, severed the tip of her right pinky finger as it closed. The finger remained in Booker's reality. The rest of Anna passed through into Comstock's. This is the wound that never heals. This is the moment that the entire story of BioShock Infinite is circling, approaching, and finally confronting in its last devastating minutes. The severed fingertip, the closed portal. Booker on his knees in an empty apartment with the tiny, terrible evidence of his failure in his hands. Anna, who would be renamed Elizabeth, who would grow up in a tower, who would spend 20 years dreaming of Paris, gone. Why the severed finger matters. Anna's existence simultaneously in two realities, her finger in Booker's world, the rest of her in Comstock's, is precisely what granted her the ability to manipulate tears in space-time. She does not merely see into other realities. She is of two realities at once, making her one of the most cosmically significant entities in the multiverse. Comstock knew this. The siphon was built specifically to contain it. Comstock brought Anna to Columbia and immediately set about constructing the mythology that would replace her real identity. She was renamed Elizabeth, a name with royal and religious connotations that suited Comstock's dynastic ambitions perfectly. Her origins were transformed into something miraculous. She was not the stolen daughter of a broken Pinkerton detective from an alternate reality, but a child sent by God to continue Comstock's sacred mission, born of divine intervention rather than ordinary biology. Every record of her true origins was destroyed or classified at the highest levels. The citizens of Columbia were told what Comstock wanted them to know, and what he wanted them to know was a beautiful lie. The tower he built to house Elizabeth was the most visible expression of his approach to her, magnificent and suffocating in equal measure. Monument Island rose from Columbia's waters as an imposing structure filled with books, art, music, and every intellectual resource a curious young woman could desire. Comstock was not entirely heartless in his treatment of the child he had stolen. He did, in his profoundly twisted way, care about Elizabeth's intellectual development, her education, her preparation for the role she would play in Columbia's future. He gave her a library that any scholar would envy, and a window on the world through art and literature and music. And he gave her the songbird, the massive mechanical guardian that served as both Elizabeth's companion and her jailer is one of the most emotionally complex creations in BioShock Infinite's already densely emotional world. It was designed to love her, or rather, to simulate love with sufficient sophistication that a young woman who had never known genuine human connection might not be able to tell the difference. It was programmed to protect her, to respond to her moods, to be there in the long isolated years of her childhood and adolescence when there was no one else. And it was programmed, with equal specificity and completeness, to prevent her from ever leaving. What Comstock also installed in Monument Island, less visibly but more powerfully, was the siphon, a massive quantum field manipulation device built into the tower's structure that actively dampened and suppressed Elizabeth's reality manipulating abilities. Because Comstock knew, from his observations of other timelines through the tiers, that Elizabeth's powers were not merely unusual, but potentially cosmic in scale. He had seen realities in which Elizabeth, her abilities fully developed and unrestricted, had become something approaching a god, capable of reshaping reality at fundamental levels, of perceiving all possible timelines simultaneously, of manipulating the constants that governed existence itself. He wanted access to those powers without losing control of the person who wielded them. The siphon was his solution. Keep her powered down, keep her contained, keep her ignorant of her true nature and true origins, and use her abilities on his own terms at times of his choosing. Elizabeth, Anna, grew up in her tower knowing nothing of this. She knew the books that lined her walls. She knew the songbird that sang to her and kept her caged. She knew the views of a city she could see but never touch, floating below her window in all its terrible beauty. She knew that she wanted to see Paris more than anything in the world, because Paris existed in the books as a place of light and art and freedom, everything that her tower was not. And she knew, in the wordless way that children know things their conscious minds cannot yet articulate, that something fundamental about her life was wrong. To truly understand what BioShock Infinite is doing, not just as a story but as a piece of political and historical commentary, you have to spend time in the texture of Columbia's social life, because that texture is where the game does some of its most important work. It would have been easy, and dramatically simpler, to make Columbia an obviously villainous place, a dystopia that announces its evil from the moment you arrive. Instead, the game does something much more sophisticated and much more disturbing. It makes Columbia beautiful first, It makes you want to be there. It fills your eyes with color and wonder, and the sheer improbable delight of walking through a city in the clouds. And only gradually, inexorably, does it reveal the scaffolding of horror that holds all of that beauty up. At the apex of Colombia's social hierarchy stood the founders, the ruling political party that Comstock had created in his own ideological image. The founders were not merely a political organization. They were a theological movement, a social club, and an enforcement mechanism all at once. Membership in the founders was effectively limited to wealthy white Protestant Americans who had demonstrated their ideological purity through adherence to the party's platform of racial supremacy, religious nationalism, and economic conservatism. They controlled Colombia's government, its economy, its cultural institutions, and its security apparatus. They were, in the most literal possible sense, Colombia's ruling class, and they believed their rule was divinely ordained. The ideology of the founders drew on real currents in early 20th century American thought, and this is one of the things that makes BioShock Infinite genuinely uncomfortable rather than merely provocative. The game is not imagining a purely fictional extremism with no connection to historical reality. Scientific racism, the pseudo-academic movement that claimed to provide biological justification for white supremacy, was a mainstream intellectual position in 1912. Manifest Destiny had been official American foreign policy for decades. The Ku Klux Klan would experience a massive national revival just 3 years after the game's setting in 1915, and at its peak would claim millions of members, including many elected officials. What Columbia represents is not a distortion of American history, but an extrapolation of it, a vision of what happens when the ugliest ideological currents of a real historical moment are given absolute power and no accountability. Below the founders in Colombia's hierarchy were the ordinary white working-class citizens who formed the bulk of the city's population. These citizens enjoyed the real and significant privileges of racial whiteness in Colombia's system. They could vote, own property, access quality education and healthcare, live in decent housing, and move through the city's public spaces without restriction or humiliation. In exchange, they provided the political support that kept the founders in power and the cultural acquiescence that normalized the violence being done to Colombia's minority populations. Most of them were not themselves ideologically committed to white supremacy in the way their leaders were. Many of them were simply living their lives, doing their work, enjoying the benefits of a system they had not designed and did not think very hard about, which is, of course, exactly how unjust systems perpetuate themselves. At the bottom of Colombia's hierarchy were the minority populations who made the city actually function, the Chinese immigrants who worked in Colombia's factories, the Irish Catholics who built its structures, the African-American workers who kept its streets clean and its kitchens running and its children cared for. These were people who had skills, who worked hard, who contributed essentially to every aspect of Colombia's existence, and who were denied in return every basic political and civil right that the founders claimed were the birthright of true Americans. They could not vote. They could not own property in the good districts. Their children attended different and drastically inferior schools. They were subject to arbitrary violence from Colombia's security forces with essentially no legal recourse. Colombia's beauty was real, its horror was real, and the game forces you to hold both truths at once, because that is precisely what the historical reality, those truths are based on, required of the people who lived through it. The propaganda apparatus that maintained all of this in place was comprehensive, sophisticated, and embedded in every aspect of daily life. Colombia's propaganda was not primarily experienced as propaganda by the people living within it. It was experienced as culture, as religion, as education, as entertainment. The kinescopes scattered throughout the city played moving pictures that told the story of Colombia's founding and its prophetic destiny in the same visual grammar as religious revelation. Schools taught children a version of American and Colombian history that presented the existing racial hierarchy as natural, divinely ordained, and beneficial to everyone, including the people at the bottom of it. Religious services wove political messaging into spiritual instruction so thoroughly that opposition to founder ideology constituted, in the theology being taught, opposition to God's own plan. The founders also maintained a carefully cultivated enemy mythology that served the classic function of all authoritarian propaganda. It gave Colombia's citizens a shared threat to fear, which in turn justified every restriction on liberty, every act of suppression, every escalation of security measures, the false shepherd prophecy, the prediction that a man bearing certain marks would arrive to lead Elizabeth astray and bring Colombia to ruin, prepared citizens psychologically to view any outsider with suspicion and to support whatever violent response the leadership deemed necessary when that outsider arrived. Comstock himself operated within this system as its supreme architect and most potent symbol. His physical presence, the aged prophet, the white beard, the prophetic pronouncements, delivered with the certainty of a man who has genuinely seen the future, which in a technical sense he had, provided the human face that the city's ideology needed. He was not merely a politician making policy arguments. He was a holy figure making sacred declarations, and the difference between those two things, in terms of the social authority they carry and the resistance they can mobilize, is enormous. Questioning Comstock's policies was not just political dissent in Colombia. It was heresy. But systems built on this degree of systematic injustice cannot sustain themselves indefinitely without generating the seeds of their own destruction. Underneath the gleaming surface of Colombia's official life, in the working districts and the servant quarters and the crowded minority neighborhoods, something was building. It had been building for years, fueled by every small humiliation and every large injustice and every unanswered prayer that things might somehow, someday be different. It had a name. It had a leader. And when the false shepherd arrived in Colombia in 1912, it was already far further along than the founders imagined. The Vox Populi, the voice of the people, was not a revolutionary organization that emerged suddenly in response to Booker DeWitt's arrival. It had been growing in the shadows of Colombia's official life for years, nurtured by the accumulating anger and desperation of everyone the founders' system had decided did not count. Its ranks included Chinese factory workers and Irish laborers and African-American servants and working-class whites who had discovered that their racial privilege did not actually protect them from the economic exploitation that the founders' system also practiced on anyone without capital. They were united not by a single ideology, but by a shared experience of exclusion and a shared determination that things could not continue as they were. Their leader was Daisy Fitzroy, and her story is one of BioShock Infinite's most morally complex portraits. She was not born a revolutionary. She was born into the same system that produced Colombia's oppression, and she spent years working within it, employed as a domestic servant in Comstock House itself, in the closest proximity to power that someone of her race and class could occupy without actually sharing it. She was good at her work. She was observant and intelligent, and she paid attention to everything around her with the quiet intensity of someone who knows that knowledge is one of the few forms of power available to her. What ended her time at Comstock House was not her own action, but a manufactured one. Lady Comstock, Comstock's wife, who had discovered the truth about Elizabeth's origins and represented a dangerous loose end to the prophet's carefully constructed mythology, was murdered on Comstock's orders. Daisy Fitzroy was framed for the killing. The evidence against her was fabricated entirely, but in Colombia's justice system, the word of a powerful white man against the word of a black woman domestic worker was not exactly a contest. She fled into the underground rather than face a certainty of execution for a crime she had not committed. And in the underground, she found the Vox Populi, who found in her exactly the kind of fearless, focused, personally aggrieved leader that a revolution needs. Fitzroy as a revolutionary leader was effective precisely because she combined genuine ideological commitment to the cause of equality with a very personal hatred of Comstock and everything he represented. She did not simply want to reform Colombia's system. She wanted to tear it down, the whole structure, root, and foundation, because she understood with the clarity of someone who had lived inside its machinery that reform was not sufficient. The mechanisms of oppression in Colombia were not incidental to the system. They were the system. You could not fix Colombia by adjusting its policies. You could only fix it by replacing its fundamental premises, about who counted as human and who didn't. The moral complexity of the Vox Populi arc is one of the things that distinguishes BioShock Infinite from simpler political narratives. The game does not present Fitzroy's revolution as unambiguously heroic, even though it presents the founder's oppression as unambiguously villainous. As the conflict escalates, as cycles of violence and retaliation accelerate, as the Vox Populi's originally focused campaign against founder infrastructure begins to shade into something uglier, targeting civilians, threatening children, allowing the logic of revolutionary violence to consume the moral framework that justified it in the first place. The game forces its audience into increasingly uncomfortable territory, the revolution's moral paradox. Through tears into alternate realities, Elizabeth witnesses versions of Columbia where the Vox Populi won the revolution but established their own oppressive regime. The game is not suggesting that the revolution was wrong. The founders' oppression was real and unjustifiable. It is suggesting that violence, even justified violence, tends to corrupt the purposes it was meant to serve, and that breaking cycles of oppression requires more than simply reversing who holds power. Elizabeth's reactions to the revolutionary violence she witnesses are among the most psychologically true moments in the game. She grew up in a tower, with books and art and music as her primary window onto the world. The Paris she dreamed of visiting was the Paris of novels and paintings, a place of elegant cafes and intellectual conversation, and the kind of romanticized freedom that only exists in art. The revolution she encounters in Columbia is not like that. It is loud and brutal, and full of people doing terrible things for comprehensible reasons, and it does not offer the clean moral satisfaction that she was hoping violence against injustice would provide. A moment of forced violence against Fitzroy, killing the revolutionary leader to protect a child that Fitzroy appears to be threatening, is deeply uncomfortable to play, and deliberately so. What the game does not tell you in that moment, but reveals through the DLC, is that the Luteces had actually coached Daisy into staging the confrontation, knowing Elizabeth would be forced to act. Daisy never intended to harm the boy. She accepted the role of monster so that Elizabeth would have the moral permission and the psychological push she needed to become capable of the harder violence that lay ahead. It reframes the entire scene in retrospect. What looked like revolution consuming its own ideals was actually a woman making a calculated, devastating sacrifice to give someone else a chance at freedom. The Vox Populi uprising also served the plot function of demonstrating the extent to which Comstock's prophetic reputation was self-fulfilling. He had prophesied that the false shepherd would arrive and set the city ablaze, and sure enough, Booker DeWitt's arrival coincided with and accelerated the very revolutionary chaos that the prophecy described. But the prophecy was not genuinely predictive, or rather, it was predictive in the same way that telling someone a bridge is structurally unsound and then dynamiting the foundation makes you seem prophetic when it collapses. The Vox Populi had been building for years. The arrival of an armed outsider pursuing a specific objective that required maximum chaos was always going to accelerate their timeline. Comstock's prophecy named the trigger. It did not create the underlying conditions that made the explosion inevitable. Those conditions were his own creation. July 6, 1912. Booker DeWitt is rowing a boat through fog off the coast of Maine, accompanied by two people he does not know and cannot quite locate in any ordinary social category. The Lutece twins sit with him in the boat and make cryptic observations about probability and the nature of choice. There is a lighthouse ahead. Booker does not know why he is here. Not really. He knows that he has a debt to pay off, that he has been told to go to the lighthouse and enter what's inside, that something called "bring us the girl and wipe away the debt" has been the organizing principle of his recent life. What he does not know, cannot know yet, is that this is not the first time he has made this trip, that the Luteces have brought at least 122 versions of him here across that many iterations, trying to find the one who can finally break the pattern, that the words "bring us the girl and wipe away the debt" are not just instructions but an echo, a distorted memory of something he himself did 19 years ago to his own daughter. Inside the lighthouse is a rocket chair that launches him into the clouds, and what awaits him there takes his breath away. Columbia is everything the propaganda promised and everything the propaganda concealed simultaneously. It is genuinely beautiful, the spires catching the light, the skylines threading between buildings like a mechanical ballet, the citizens in their period finery going about their lives with the specific grace of people who believe God has personally approved their existence. And it is genuinely sinister, the monuments to the founding fathers rendered as religious icons, the propaganda posters warning against foreign influence, the architecture of racial segregation so thoroughly embedded in the city's design that most of its citizens have stopped seeing it as architecture at all. Booker moves through Columbia's Founders' Day celebration, the 10th anniversary of the city's secession from the United States, marking 1902 to 1912, trying to remain inconspicuous. He is looking for Monument Island, where Elizabeth is imprisoned. He needs to get in, get her out, and get to the First Lady's airship, which he has been told will take them to a handoff point, where his debt will be cleared. This is the plan, such as it is. Simple extraction, a job. Get in, get the girl, get out. What blows his cover is a moment of moral refusal that is characteristic of the man Booker DeWitt, actually is beneath the surface of his cynical mercenary persona. The Founders' Day celebration includes a raffle run by Jeremiah Fink, and when Booker picks up a numbered baseball and his number is called, he is brought on stage. Winning the raffle turns out to mean being given the honor of throwing the first baseball at an interracial couple who have been locked in cages on stage as public punishment for their relationship. And Booker, who has done terrible things in his life, who participated in a massacre, who sold his own daughter, who has taken jobs that required him to set his moral compass firmly in a drawer. Booker cannot do this. He will not do this. He refuses. And in the moment of his refusal, someone notices the brand on his right hand, the letters AD, burned into his skin, which he has always carried as a self-inflicted mark of his failure, as a father, a reminder of Anna DeWitt, the daughter he gave away. But in Columbia's mythology, those letters mean something very different. They are the mark of the false shepherd, prophesied by Comstock as the sign of the man who would come to lead Elizabeth astray and bring Columbia to ruin. In the space of seconds, Booker DeWitt goes from anonymous tourist to the most wanted man in the floating city. His path to Monument Island is necessarily violent, and the game makes sure you understand what that violence costs. Booker is extraordinarily good at killing people. This is established clearly and without glamorization. He moves through Columbia's increasingly hostile defenses with the mechanical efficiency of someone who was trained to do this by the United States Army and has been doing it professionally ever since. But Elizabeth, when she sees the aftermath of his violence, does not celebrate it or ignore it. She responds to it with the moral clarity of someone who has not yet been taught to accept carnage as normal, and her response is horrified, questioning, refusing to look away, keep the moral weight of the violence from disappearing into the background of the action. When Booker finally reaches Monument Island and finds Elizabeth, their first meeting is exactly as awkward and complicated as you would expect a meeting between a jaded mercenary and a 20-year-old woman who has never spoken to another human being in any meaningful way to be. Elizabeth is terrified. She is also desperately, almost painfully hopeful. Booker represents the outside world, which she has only ever experienced through books and windows. He represents Paris, which she has wanted her whole life. He represents freedom, even if he is also, in ways she cannot yet know, and he cannot yet remember, the source of her captivity. The Songbirds' pursuit of them, as they flee Monument Island, is the first of the game's genuinely spectacular action set pieces, but it is also an emotional statement about the nature of Elizabeth's captivity. The songbird does not pursue her because it has been ordered to, or rather, it pursues her because the order to keep her contained has been internalized so completely that from the songbird's perspective, keeping Elizabeth in her tower is an act of love. It is protecting her. It is doing what it was made to do. The horror of that, of a guardian whose protective love is indistinguishable from its function as a jailer, is one of the most quietly devastating aspects of the game's world building. As Booker and Elizabeth make their way through Columbia, Her abilities begin to manifest more strongly with every mile they put between themselves and the siphon on Monument Island. What starts as the ability to open small tiers and pull objects or supplies through from other realities gradually expands into something more powerful and harder to control. She opens tiers during firefights without meaning to, dramatically changing the conditions of combat. She perceives things that she should not be able to perceive, fragments of other timelines bleeding through into her awareness. And she begins, in fragmented flashes, to remember things that contradict the official story of her life. A father who is not Comstock, a name that is not Elizabeth, a loss that she cannot locate but can feel like a phantom limb. The revelations accumulate slowly, and then all at once. The truth about Lady Comstock's murder. The truth about Comstock's order to have Jeremiah Fink sabotage the Lutece device. An assassination that instead scattered the twins across all realities. The truth about Elizabeth's origins, confirmed through evidence scattered throughout the game's environments, and through Elizabeth's own expanding perception of parallel realities. And finally, most devastatingly, the truth that Zachary Hale Comstock and Booker DeWitt are not enemies in the traditional sense, not two different people with opposing agendas, but the same person, divided by a single moment of choice at a river, pursuing the same fundamental story through different versions of their shared life. The prophet and the false shepherd. The father who took his daughter and the father who let her go. The man who accepted the baptism and the man who refused it. They are, in every quantum mechanical sense that matters, the same person. And the debt that Booker has been sent to pay off is not financial. It is moral. It is the debt a man owes himself, or rather, owes his daughter, for having been, in one reality or another, both the perpetrator of her suffering and the instrument of her potential rescue. The destruction of the siphon on Monument Island is the pivot point of BioShock Infinite's narrative. The moment when everything that has been building finally cracks open and reveals the full scope of what we are actually dealing with. When Booker and Elizabeth, having gained control of the Songbird, direct it to tear apart the massive device that has been suppressing Elizabeth's abilities since childhood, the result is not just a tactical victory. It is a transformation. Elizabeth, with the siphon's dampening field removed, does not simply become more powerful. She becomes something qualitatively different. A being whose awareness expands beyond the boundaries of individual timeline and individual moment into the vast, terrifying, unbounded space of infinite possibility. She calls it the Sea of Doors. From her perspective, in the moments following the siphon's destruction, reality is not a single stream moving forward from past to future. It is an infinite ocean of simultaneous possibilities, each one as real as every other, each one playing out the same fundamental story with different variables. She can see versions of Columbia in which the Vox Populi won, and versions in which they were crushed, and versions in which the city never existed at all. She can see versions of herself and Booker in every conceivable configuration of their relationship. She can see, most importantly for the story's resolution, the quantum threads that connect all of these versions at their root, the constants that persist across every timeline regardless of what variables have changed. The concept of constants and variables is BioShock Infinite's most original and most philosophically ambitious contribution to the language of storytelling in games. Constants are the elements that persist across all timelines, the invariant features of the story that cannot be changed by any individual choice because they are constitutive of the structure within which all choices occur. Variables are the infinite ways those constants can be expressed, the specific details that differ from one timeline to another, while the fundamental architecture remains the same. Elizabeth articulates this framework in one of the game's most quoted lines. There is always a man, always a lighthouse, always a city. The man is the central character whose fundamental nature and central conflict persist across all realities, even though his specific choices and circumstances vary enormously. The lighthouse is the gateway, the transition point between states of being, between one version of the story and another. The city is the expression of the man's vision, the physical manifestation of what his choices have created, whether that city floats in the sky above a theocratic floating empire or sinks beneath the sea in an objectivist dystopia. This framework, once understood, recontextualizes not just BioShock Infinite, but the entire BioShock series. The brief glimpse of Rapture, Andrew Ryan's underwater city from the original BioShock, that appears during Elizabeth's expanded perception, is not just a fan service nod to the earlier game. It is a demonstration that the constants and variables framework operates at the level of the entire fictional universe. A man who believed in radical individual freedom took a lighthouse to an underwater city. A man who believed in radical national destiny took a lighthouse to a floating city. Different variables, same constants, different expressions of the same fundamental human tendency to build a paradise that becomes a hell. There is always a man, always a lighthouse, always a city. In 6 words, BioShock Infinite revealed that its story was not about Booker DeWitt or Zachary Comstock. It was about what happens when any man gives any idea absolute power over any society. What Elizabeth's expanded awareness also reveals is the reason why the Lutece's previous attempts to fix the problem by bringing Booker to Columbia had failed. They had been trying to change variables, specific outcomes, specific events, specific choices that characters made within the story, but the problem was structural. It existed at the level of constants. As long as the moment of the baptism at Wounded Knee was possible, as long as Booker DeWitt could walk up to that river and either accept or reject the preacher's offer of spiritual transformation, then Comstock could always exist. The baptism was the fork in the quantum road, and every time the Luteces brought a new version of Booker to Columbia, they were working downstream from that fork, trying to drain the flood without closing the dam. Elizabeth's realization of all this comes at enormous psychological cost. The burden of perceiving all possible outcomes across infinite realities is not merely intellectually overwhelming, it is emotionally annihilating. She can see every version of herself, every version of her suffering, every version of her liberation, every version of her relationship with Booker, with the man who is her father, who she has come to trust, who is also in another reality, the man who stole her childhood. She can see, with absolute clarity, that preventing Comstock's crimes in their specific timeline will accomplish nothing in the aggregate, because in an infinite multiverse, the prevention of one Comstock merely means that the countless others will continue their crimes unimpeded. The only solution, the only action that actually addresses the problem at the level of constants rather than variables, is to go back to the fork, to return to the river baptism, to prevent the moment when Booker DeWitt becomes Zachary Hale Comstock from ever occurring, not in one timeline but in all of them simultaneously, to eliminate the Comstock possibility from the structure of reality itself, at the moment before the divergence, where all timelines are still one. This is where the game takes us in its final act, through the sea of doors, through the infinite gateways between realities that Elizabeth can now perceive and navigate. She and Booker travel backwards through time and across the quantum landscape of possibility to arrive at a river in 1890, where a young man is deciding whether or not to let a preacher push him under the water. And there, accompanied by versions of Elizabeth, from every possible timeline, all the women she might have been, all the childhood she might have had, all the futures that would unfold or not unfold, depending on what happens next, Booker DeWitt makes his final choice. He chooses to drown. He chooses to prevent the baptism. He chooses, in the most literal possible sense, to unmake himself, or rather, to prevent the possibility of himself ever becoming the man who did the things that Comstock did. It is an act of self-sacrifice, but it is more than that. It is an act of cosmic accountability, a man accepting responsibility not just for his own specific sins, but for the infinite catalogue of sins that his alternate selves committed across the breadth of the multiverse. It is the only form of redemption, the game suggests, that is actually proportionate to the scale of the harm that was done. The ending of BioShock Infinite is one of the most discussed, debated, analyzed, and emotionally devastating conclusions in the history of the medium, and it deserves more than a quick summary. It deserves to be understood in full, mechanically, narratively, philosophically, because its complexity is precisely the point. It is not trying to leave you satisfied. It is trying to leave you thinking. And a decade after the game's release, It is still doing exactly that. The final sequence begins with Elizabeth leading Booker through the Sea of Doors, through the glowing infinite gateways that represent every possible version of their story, back to the specific moment and place where everything diverged. The river in 1890 is rendered with a quietness and a stillness that contrasts absolutely with the explosive violence that has preceded it. The crowd at the river baptism is still, pale, watching. The preacher is ready. The water is cold. And standing around the edges of the scene, robed and luminous, are multiple versions of Elizabeth. Not just one, not just two, but a gathered multitude of every Elizabeth who might have existed across all the timelines where these events were eventually corrected. They are witnesses. They are also, in a very real sense, the proof of what is at stake. Every one of them is a possible version of the daughter whose existence depends on what Booker chooses now. The drowning itself is rendered with a solemnity that makes clear it is not an accident and not a fight. It is a choice, made deliberately, accepted willingly. Booker allows himself to be submerged. He does not resist. And as the water closes over his head, as he ceases to be before the choice point is reached, the versions of Elizabeth around him begin, one by one, to fade. Because if Booker never accepts the baptism, then Comstock never exists. And if Comstock never exists, then Columbia is never built in the way it was built, and Elizabeth is never stolen, and the Elizabeth who was shaped by imprisonment and the songbird and 20 years of enforced isolation never becomes. She is free of all of that, but she is also, in her specific form, undone. The post-credits scene, Booker waking in his apartment, calling out for Anna, opening the door to the nursery, is the game's final, deliberate ambiguity. Is this a restored timeline in which the sale of Anna never happened? Is it a new reality created by the quantum intervention at the baptism? Or is it yet another iteration in the infinite sea of possibilities? And the game is showing us not a resolution but a continuation. The game does not tell us. It cuts to black before we can see whether Anna is there. And that ambiguity is not a failure of narrative nerve. It is a statement. It is the game refusing to offer the comfortable closure that would allow the audience to stop sitting with the questions it has raised. Because the questions BioShock Infinite raises are not questions that have clean answers. Can a man be redeemed for sins he committed in another life? If your alternate self committed atrocities that you did not commit, are you responsible for them? If you have the power to prevent infinite suffering across infinite realities by erasing yourself from existence, is that act heroic, or is it a new form of violence? A cosmic death penalty administered not for crimes you committed, but for crimes you might commit in quantum possibilities you never actually experienced. Elizabeth's decision to orchestrate Booker's drowning is morally complex in ways the game is honest enough not to simplify. It is the right thing to do within the story's logic. It is also an act of terrible intimacy, a daughter participating in her father's death to prevent the version of her father who stole her childhood from ever existing. The love and the violence of that are inseparable. The burial at sea connection. One Comstock escaped the destruction of his timeline before the events of the main game, fleeing to Rapture's reality and assuming the alias of a private investigator also named Booker DeWitt, his trauma having stripped him of his memories as a prophet. Episode 2 shifts to Elizabeth as the playable character, navigating Rapture during its civil war. In exchange for rescuing the little sister Sally, Elizabeth provides Atlas, actually Frank Fontaine, with the ace in the hole, the trigger phrase, "Would you kindly?" used to control Jack in the events of the original BioShock. Elizabeth is killed by Atlas before she can see whether this sacrifice holds, but dies having a final vision of Jack saving Sally and the little sisters, completing the chain that connects all 3 BioShock games through one final act of costly, clear-eyed compassion. The legacy of BioShock Infinite in gaming culture is substantial and still growing. Its narrative ambition, the decision to tell a story explicitly about quantum mechanics, multiverse theory, the nature of identity, and the relationship between personal trauma and political violence, demonstrated that mainstream games with mainstream budgets could engage seriously with philosophical questions that had previously been the territory of academic philosophy and literary fiction. It proved concretely, and commercially, that there was an audience for this kind of complexity, that players would engage with it, argue about it, analyze it, and still be talking about it years later. The visual design of Columbia became one of gaming's most distinctive and recognizable aesthetic achievements. The combination of Gilded Age American architecture with steampunk technology, religious iconography, and the sheer physical impossibility of the floating city created something that felt both historically grounded and genuinely fantastical, a world that could only exist in fiction, but that felt, while you were inside it, completely real. The art direction informed subsequent games, and media that wanted to explore American historical mythology through speculative or fantastical lenses. The relationship between Booker and Elizabeth set new standards for AI companion design that are still being pointed to as benchmarks. Elizabeth felt like a person, rather than a gameplay mechanic, curious and frightened and funny, and morally serious and occasionally infuriating, and capable of growth in ways that felt genuine. The voice performances of Troy Baker and Courtney Draper were essential to this achievement, bringing to their characters a specificity and an emotional authenticity that elevated everything around them. Their chemistry gave the game its emotional center of gravity, the thing that made you care about the quantum physics and the political allegory and the philosophical framework because you cared about what happened to these two specific people. The game's engagement with American history, its unflinching portrayal of racism, religious nationalism, and the violence of American expansion, sparked debates that are, if anything, more urgent now than they were in 2013. BioShock Infinite arrived at a cultural moment when many Americans were beginning to grapple more seriously with the legacies of historical injustice, and it provided a language, fictional, safely distanced from direct political argument, but unmistakable in its implications for thinking about those legacies. It said explicitly and at length that the ideologies Columbia embodies are not merely historically distant evils, but expressions of currents that run through American life from its founding to its present. It said this through a video game to an audience of millions, and a significant portion of that audience heard it. The critical reception was overwhelmingly positive, Metacritic scores in the low to mid-90s across platforms, universal praise for its ambition and its world building and its characters, more measured responses to specific aspects of the design, including the violence and the sometimes abrupt tonal shifts. The complex ending generated the full spectrum of reactions from awe to confusion to outright frustration, and the debate about whether the ending worked has generated more intelligent critical writing about video game narrative than almost any other single artistic moment in the medium's history. What BioShock Infinite ultimately is, beneath all of its quantum mechanics and political allegory and multiverse philosophy, is a story about a father and a daughter and the consequences of the worst choice he ever made. It is a story about guilt, about the way guilt, left unprocessed and unfaced, can transform into something monstrous, can build cities in the sky and fill them with ideology and violence and beautiful architecture that hides a horror at its foundation. It is a story about whether the past can be undone, and whether undoing it is the same thing as making it right. And it is a story about the specific, extraordinary difficulty of looking at what you have done, not what your alternate self did, not what the version of you who made different choices did, but what you did, and accepting full accountability for it, without flinching away into the comfort of alternative narratives. Zachary Hale Comstock built a city to make himself into someone who had never done the terrible things at Wounded Knee. He gave himself a new name, a new history, a new theology that explained everything that had happened as part of God's design, rather than his own failure of character. He built the most elaborate false narrative in the history of video game fiction, and he suspended it in the clouds where no one could touch it or question it. And in the end, the version of him who had refused that transformation, who had carried the guilt raw and unprocessed and devastating for 20 years, was the one who had to drown them both. There is always a man, there is always a lighthouse, there is always a city, and somewhere in the infinite possibilities of what any one of us might become, given different choices at crucial moments, there is always both the builder of Columbia and the one who finally has to bring it down. BioShock Infinite's extraordinary achievement is making us feel deeply and uncomfortably and unforgettably that both of those people might be living inside the same skin. Thank you for traveling with us through the complete story of Columbia. There is always another story waiting to be discovered, and until next time, keep asking the questions that the cities in the clouds would prefer you didn't. We'll see you on the other side of the lighthouse. There is always a man, always a lighthouse, always a city. But most importantly, there is always another story waiting to be discovered.